I don't believe that the term left-wing and right-wing are very useful anymore, or if they ever were. Now, I do believe that there are certain cognitive traits, types. I was looking at this website called Neuropolitics, where they go into this in great detail, and they talk about liberal left brain, or conservative left brain, liberal right brain, and they talk about all these different, the color preferences of conservatives and liberals, and all sorts of cognitive differences. And I certainly believe that that people do have innate differences in wiring of their brain, and these innate differences in their brain wiring are going to make them more or less predisposed to certain political ideologies. Okay, but what political ideologies and what ideas that they are predisposed to at any given point in time in history is largely dependent on historical context. Let me give you an example here. Environmentalism. Environmentalism, is that a left-wing thing or a right-wing thing? Well, let's say you're in Britain in 1200 AD, or England in 1200 AD. And the king, he wants to not open certain areas for farming, right? It's land that's shut off to the peasants and is kept in nature, right? The peasants are not, they're allowed to wander through, but they're not allowed to hunt the king's deer. They're not allowed to cultivate the land that they could use, that land that they desperately need for more food production. But that's not, the king likes the nature. The king likes to preserve the nature as opposed to opening it up to industry to help poor people. Now, is being an environmentalist then, is that a left-wing thing or a right-wing thing? And so it kind of breaks down. Now, at that point in history, a certain cognitive type will support the king and another cognitive type will oppose the king. But that's kind of what I'm talking about. Now, another thing we can look at is, left libertarianism. What is left libertarianism? Libertarianism can be said to be basically against state interference in things. Okay, so why is there a left libertarianism and a right libertarianism? Does it have to do with certain social values? Well, maybe. But what is called left libertarianism is simply more of a focus on very social issues, feminism, anti-racism, okay, various other things. Okay, let's talk about female voting rights. Is that a left-wing position or a right-wing position, allowing females to vote? Well, certainly today it would be considered a left-wing thing, but there was a period around late 1800s when women were not allowed to vote in Britain, and there was talk about giving women the vote. The socialists did not want the women to have the vote because women tended to shy away from radical politics, and at the time, socialism was radical politics. The socialists and the anarchists did not want women to vote because they would vote against them, and their power would be diminished even further. So, in that situation, was the left-wing thing to do to oppose female voting? It's not really a clear thing right there. Would allowing females to vote, would that be the right-wing position in that situation? Now, I look at things like National Socialist Germany and South Africa. National Socialist Germany, you had a racially motivated political party that was big on various welfare programs. One thing that they had that really sticks out was that if you had 4 kids, you would get a free house. If you had 1 kid, the house would be a quarter paid off, 2 kids, half, until you had 4 kids, and you basically got a free house. And of course, there was a racial element to this. They wanted to expand the size of their race. And so they were a very racially motivated political party, and they were big government welfare political party. And the enemy of them was a racial minority in Germany at the time, were the Jews. Jews, of course, were a market-dominant minority. That is, they had disproportionate economic power, disproportionate probably disproportionate influence. I don't know as much about that. Per capita, right? They may have been like 2% of the population, but control like 15% of the economy or something like that. That's a market-dominant minority. You look at South Africa. South Africa, you have a market-dominant minority, white people. Okay? White people are only something like 13% of the population there, yet they own like half the land. I haven't been keeping track on it. I'm sure it's gone down quite a bit. And the ANC, of course, is the party of the black people there, the party of the blacks. And the enemy of this party is white people who are oppressing them and doing all this stuff. Now, some people may say, well, of course, the whites were oppressing the blacks in South Africa. Well, South Africa, the reality is a bit more complicated than that. The reality basically being that white people showed up to South Africa. About 90% of the blacks in South Africa today came after the Europeans had showed up, right? So most Europeans who live in South Africa have lived in South Africa longer than most of the blacks there, right? So the white people are closer to being natives of that area than the black people are, because the black people primarily came from the north, right? From which was formerly the Zulu region, okay, and they emigrated south. Anyway, so if you look at the ANC, is that a left-wing organization or a right-wing organization? Well, they are a racially motivated party. They have big welfarism, and they blame their problems on an outgroup, right? The whites. Okay, National Socialist German Workers' Party, right? They're racially motivated, big welfare, and they blame their problems on the outgroup, Jews, and also on communists, which led to problems abroad, ultimately their undoing. So which is left wing, which is right wing, right? That's another example where left wing and right wing doesn't really make sense. You could say that, oh, the National Socialists were they were oppressors, they were in power, and they were increasing their power, or something like that. That's not how they saw it, okay? And whereas on the other hand, oh, the blacks in South Africa, they were powerless and disenfranchised, and they were fighting back against the power. That's not how I see it. I don't see it that way. I see them having power in one way, the whites having power in another way, and the blacks trying to neutralize the kind of power that whites had. That's what I see. I see it as a power struggle between two relatively even blocks, and the blacks wanting to change the rules so that their numbers now count for more. Anyway, we can also look at gun rights. Okay. We can look at, say, Nazi Germany. The gun control was not quite as extensive as most people think. Well, let's skip that example. And let's look at, say, Jim Crow South and wanting to have gun control, wanting to have strict laws on preventing acquisition of firearms. Now, of course, the motivation for this was racial, because these policies would have a disparate racial impact. Similar to how a voter ID, whites, for whatever reason, tend to have an easier time getting ID than other groups of people, right? So voter ID laws are going to have a disparate impact, and they're going to disparately suppress the black vote and the Mestizo vote relative to the white vote. So when you have strong voter ID laws, it's going to be, in fact, it's not de jure vote suppression, but it is de facto vote suppression. Okay, so if we look at gun laws, and you have strict gun laws, who is more able to jump through hoops on average as a group? Is it going to be black people or white people? Well, it's going to be white people are better able to jump through hoops, right? And this is another thing, this is kind of an aside, when you have a heavily regulated economy, the wealth gap between the races is probably going to expand. Well, the wealth gap in general is going to expand, and the wealth gap between races is also going to expand, because now what you've done is you've erected a bunch of hoops to get your business started. And the groups that are best at jumping through, legal hoops, all this legal BS, are going to be people like East Asians and whites, because they have their stuff in order. And you can say, well, that's because of historical reasons, whatever. For whatever reason, they have their stuff in order, and so they're more able to jump through those hoops, and so the racial wealth gaps are going to widen. Anyway, that's just a bit of an aside. But anyway, okay, so gun rights in that situation would supporting stricter gun control laws, would that have been supporting stricter gun control laws in the Jim Crow South, would that have been a right-wing thing to do or a left-wing thing to do? Because the purpose was to disparately impact and effectively disarm blacks. Is that left-wing or right-wing to do? Well, somebody would say it's left-wing. Okay, whereas gun control laws today, making it harder to get a gun and to effectively disarm the whole citizenry to an extent, that left-wing or right-wing. Okay, let's say you have a situation where, the U.S. federal government wants to disarm the general citizenry so that the general citizenry can't revolt in like an organized militia. Is that left-wing or right-wing? Right? Who's the powerful group and who's the weak group? You know, so it breaks down in that sense. Okay, abortion. Here's another situation. Abortion. Okay, well, one way to look at it, well, we need to help women, okay, women's rights. And if a woman gets raped or a woman gets knocked up, it should be her body. She shouldn't be oppressed by men, be told what to do by men, right? That's the thing. Is women are the weaker group, and they need to be have the right, and they need to have the choice for themselves. Okay, who's weaker than an adult woman? Would the fetus be weaker than the adult woman? Right. So in a sense, you could go one step lower and say, oh, the unborn, they're the oppressed group. You need to advocate for them. Okay. So which is more left wing? Like you could say, well, by advocating for the fetus, I'm also advocating against women's right to choose. You are, okay. And women are a out of power group. I don't believe that, but if you believe that, so is that right? Which is the left wing? Which is the right wing? It's not really clear. Okay, then you could say adventurous foreign policy. That's a right wing thing. You know, pacifism is a left wing thing. Well, this is really context dependent. Some people will say, well, George Bush and his invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan are right-wing things. He was a right-wing president with right-wing policies. Well, first off, George Bush, I mean, what does he do? Well, he institutes the guest worker programs for the Hispanics. He has the No Child Left Behind Act, which many have come to the conclusion that it was a bad policy, but I would say that that's kind of like a welfare social thing. And then, of course, the prescription drug plan. And domestic government grew quite rapidly under George Bush. And Obama has deported more Mestizos than George Bush ever did. Right? The Obama administration, not Obama himself, but the Obama administration has deported more Hispanics than George Bush did. Okay. So say George Bush's right wing doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Okay, so but invading other countries, is that a left wing or a right wing thing to do? Some would say, oh, that's right wing. Well, what is the motivation for invading these countries? I mean, you could say some of the motivation was oil and cronyism and no-bid contracts and kickbacks, and certainly I'm not denying that there is some of that. I'm not denying that. Okay, but you can't make a whole meal out of cronyism. Right? There has to be some ideology there. Right? You can point to cronyism in the war racket in World War I. But so are we going to say that the U.S. entered World War I because of the war racket, because of all the profiteering, and certain industrialists who greased the palms of politicians? No, there's a great deal of idealism that went in there and true ideology, right? Invading Iraq, why? Invade Iraq, depose a dictator, and impose democracy there, right? And have people vote, have people have a voice for the people, and all that. Sounds like a very left-wing. Invading Afghanistan, giving women the right to vote, something unheard of in that part of the world. Is that a left-wing thing, or is it a right-wing thing? Yeah. And so it's odd to see St. Ugur celebrating the point at which the majority of people in the U.S. stopped supporting the Afghanistan war. Like, well, isn't the Afghanistan war basically a bunch of white people are going into far off corners of the world to help a bunch of brown people to export liberal ideas like women's rights and voting, and maybe something else that could come from that. But so how can one be? That seems like a very left-wing war in the colloquial sense. But of course, when I say that, I think, well, is it really? Because what is left-wing? How about free markets? Is free market capitalism a left-wing thing or a right-wing thing? Well, we look at it when it first came about. When it first came about, markets were in opposition to feudal rights and kind of this prescribed order. You had the lords, and they said the peasants, and you had a whole medieval hierarchy. It was really complicated. So you had the prescribed hierarchy, and then you had the flux of the market. Now, in that situation, which would be liberal and which would be left-wing and which would be right-wing? Would we say that the monarchists and the feudalists, that they were the left-wingers because they supported more state control over the economy or something? Okay. Similarly, if we look at, say, Nazi Germany, saying, you know what, you capitalists, you don't need all that money. We're going to take some of that money from you, and we're going to spend that money on programs to help our race procreate and settle the world and expand the race throughout the world, as opposed to having free markets. And so what you have is kind of a prescribed racial state in contradistinction to letting the market run and letting those businesses and tycoons keep their profits. So which is left-wing and which is right-wing in that sense? You could say in the world today, well, in the U.S. today, supporting all these social welfare programs, that's left-wing, whereas opposing them is right-wing. Okay. But if we look at, say, blacks and mestizos as racially nationalistic groups, which they are, okay, you have National Council of the Race, okay, you have all sorts of, friggin' alphabet soup of black organization, black association of cardiologists, of lawyers, black caucus, black all sorts of things, right? Why? And why do they get membership in? Because they are black, by race, not by culture. It's not a cultural thing. It is a racial thing. And so these groups of people, well, they support, big welfares and big social programs, and they are quite explicit in that their support for these programs is a result of these programs disproportionately funneling money from whites to them. And then they point out that opposition to these programs, well, you're just racist because you don't like black people getting all that stuff. You don't like Hispanics getting all that stuff. Okay. So which is left-wing and which is right-wing in that situation? Some people may say, well, blacks have a right to be that way, whereas the whites in Germany did not, because the blacks were oppressed. Right? And so you can say that the parallel between blacks and mestizos in the U.S. to whites in Germany taxing the capitalists in order to support their racial interests, that parallel is not complete because the blacks and mestizos really are oppressed or something. But of course, that's disputed. That's basically your separation of those two things has to do with this group of people being oppressed. Okay. Democracy. Is democracy a left-wing thing or a right-wing thing? Okay. Let's think about, say, Tsarist Russia. Okay. I don't know if it was Tsarist Russia or Austria-Hungary. Anyway, there was some monarchy where the monarch protected the Jews in the country. The general public did not like the Jews, wanted to do bad things to the Jews, wanted to marginalize them, kick them out, even kill them en masse. But the monarch protected them. And then you have then you have a democratic revolution, the monarchy is overthrown, and then once the monarchy is overthrown, who gets it? Who gets it? The Jews. Right? What they wanted to do all the time. So in that sense, is democracy left-wing, supporting the people's will to go, butcher and abuse the Jews? Is that left-wing, or is that or supporting the monarchy left-wing? I think you could look at a similar situation in Libya with the Libyans and their treatment of the blacks in Libya. Okay, Gaddafi protected the blacks in Libya. I believe he disproportionately employed them in the security forces. And of course, once Gaddafi fell, the blacks were targeted and they were killed, right? And they're abused. So, which is left wing and which is right wing? Is supporting Gaddafi the right wing thing, or is supporting the people and their attacks on the blacks? Is that the left wing thing, or what? Okay, I've already been over what I could say, black nationalism or Mestizo nationalism / Aztlan kind of people. That's viewed, right? So you look at that. That's a left-wing thing, whereas white nationalism, that's a right-wing thing. And I noticed this, and it was very odd because I was noting there's this guy who wrote 2 books. One was a complete guide to the radical right and a complete guide to the radical left. And in the radical right, he had all these different groups, and then he had white nationalism. And on the radical left, he had all these groups, and then he had black nationalism and the Aztlan movement. And I was thinking, that's very strange, you know? All of these groups, they're all racially nationalistic movements, but one is called left-wing and one is called right-wing. And I think it's because one is viewed as oppressed. They say they're oppressed, whereas the other is trying to reinforce the power structure, the white power structure, the white male power structure. Of course, I don't believe in that. So why, you know, that's, and so you could say, well, the distinction is based on one group being in power, one group being out of power. But when I look at elections, I think, if anything, the black nationalists and the Mestizo nationalists are far more in power than the white nationalists are. Okay, I don't see state governors trying to shut down La Raza meetups, right? I don't, you know, I see on campuses, you know, MECHA, a student organization for Aztlan. They are a racial separatist organization which has all sorts of campus chapters and stuff. They are they are overtly racialist. Okay, if white people try to do the same thing, there's a fighter in the UFC that has, you know, blazoned across his chest, brown pride, brown pride. What if you had a white guy do that and had white pride? Oh, that would be evil because white people are in power and oppressing and all that stuff. Well, in power, what is? You see how that's kind of self-contradictory? Because if you know, white people really were as powerful as one could be, as it is said, then they should have no problem saying white pride, right? Now, I think what they mean by in power, they mean has more money. Right? I think that's what most people mean when they say white people have more power because they have more money. Money equals power. But I don't... Is that true? Certainly, whoever that person is who wrote the book, Rules for Radicals, did not believe that at all. He did not believe that one bit. He did not believe that money equaled power at all. And moreover, if you look at data on using repeat challengers, tends to show that money does not win elections. Okay. All right. And so that's just what I wanted to say. Kind of, this is not a real definitive video. I just wanted to throw a lot of doubt out there. I just wanted to seed doubt and seed a lot of cognitive dissonance. You know, what is left-wing and what is right-wing, and are they really useful things? And how much does left-wing and right-wing really even play into politics? Perhaps there is a certain left-wing kind of person and a right-wing kind of person, and these people will gravitate towards positions on issues depending on historical context. But most of the political conflicts that are occurring in the United States, in my opinion, are not a matter of left versus right. They are a matter of various groups with various group ideologies. You know, just I see it as a whole bunch of secular churches, secular religious sects that are in conflict with each other, and they form blocks and coalitions, and then they fight each other, right? And one block coalition calls themselves the leftists, and one calls themselves the rightists, but that's really mostly what it is. It's not really a true philosophical distinction between left wing and right wing. It's just It's just a million and one nationalisms all going at each other, and that all is in fact nationalism, or at least in my mind's eye, about 80% of what's going on in the United States is not a matter of some sort of philosophical left wing or right wing, but is in fact just various nationalistic and various nationalisms, ideological and racial and religious nationalisms, just duking it out with each other.